Mangnall.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I should like to begin by saying that while I may disagree with a member from Rother Valley and Dudley North, I believe that it is welcome to see a debate taking place in this chamber and a small step forward to returning to normal when we can look beyond these pandemic measures and have proper, right and rigorous discussion about how we can reform and improve things in this country and across the world. And since, Madam Deputy Speaker, we have a bit of time, I thought I could start with a little bit of rebuttal, because I listened to the member for Rother Valley talk about how we should focus our spending in the Commonwealth. But I would respectfully say to him, aid goes where it is most needed, and if he wants to have value for money, then it cannot be directed specifically to a cultural, historical, political, trading organisation. And that is why we must make sure we have an aid programme that delivers for the people, whether it be in Syria or any other Commonwealth country for that matter. I'd be delighted to.
My honourable friend is already making a brilliant speech, but on the point about the Commonwealth, does he agree with me that actually vast amounts of our humanitarian support and development aid do go to Commonwealth countries because British aid goes above all to the places where we have an historic connection?
Totally agree. And I think the point that I'm trying to make is that while we should use it towards the Commonwealth, we should use it to enhance our ties, we should allow them to see it directed as something that benefits because of our history. It is also an opportunity for us to look beyond that. Now, I start my speech now by congratulating the member for Rother Valley. It is always a pleasure to speak, Rotherham. It is always a pleasure to be able to follow her in her debates and to listen to her speak on a whole host of different issues. And thus far, Madam Deputy Speaker, we have had a number of hugely impressive speeches. The Right Honourable Member for Sutton Coldfield, for Maidenhead, and the Chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, just to mention a few. They have all stood up and spoken about the value that international aid has from this country to others, and what it does to motivate, to save, to help, and to assist. And of course, there was also the point that was made at the very beginning, which is the International Development Committee has not been given the true and accurate figures that it deserves. Now, I stood up and spoke on retaining the International Development Committee. I believe it has a value in scrutinising our foreign aid budgets, and I believe that it must be secured. So if it is not getting the correct information, I hope we might hear more about this, because it is essential that you are given the tools to be able to do your job. Madam Deputy Speaker, the problem with estimates debates is that it takes away from the reality of what we are actually talking about. We are standing in this chamber talking about the vaccinations donated, the school books gifted, the sexual violence perpetrators brought to justice. We are talking about the de-radicalisation of terrorist organisations, all of which happens through our aid budget. All of which happens through that 0.7% budget. And so to talk about estimates takes away from the reality of the extraordinary work that we do across the country. And members may disagree with that. They may suggest that their constituents are not supportive of it. But when you stop polling and start asking them about international security, when you start asking about women's education, when you start asking about vaccinations, when you start asking about justice for those who have committed rape in conflict zones across the world, you get a very different answer to the polls that are put out. And I hope I would be delighted to.
Honourable Friend, a very powerful speech, as it always does, on an issue of importance. And I would agree with him when we ask residents about sexual violence, of conflict. People do want answers, but when I speak to people in Rother Valley about these issues, they say, what about the sexual violence in Maltby? What about the conflict in Dillington, the gangs, the knifings? And we've got to be realistic. There's only so much money in the budget. If the budget is cut, that are not cut here, it will be cut somewhere else. And residents of Rother Valley do not want it cut then.
With the greatest of respect, the policing budget is not being cut. And on top of which, the honourable gentleman is trying to make the point that by cutting the international aid budget, he's going to see that money in Rother Valley. He's not. It will go back into the Treasury. And I go back to the point that was made by the Right Honourable Gentleman for Sutton Coldfield of how small this is in terms of Treasury percentages and spending. Now, I asked the member for South West Wiltshire earlier about what temporary would look like, and he said a year. And I would respectfully say to the government, if they come to the dispatch box and say that it is a year, I will acquiesce, I will sit down, I will accept that a year's cut is what needs to be done. And I would argue that many other members in this House would do so also. Unfortunately, Madam Deputy Speaker, we have found ourselves in somewhat of a predicament. The cut that has been announced from 0.7% to 0.5% was made off the cuff at such rapid speed that organisations like War Child, Halo, and to name just two out of many hundreds, had their budgets cut and their international programmes jeopardised. Delighted to.
For giving way. He makes a very important point about the speed of the cuts announced, but that is compounded with the general cut with GNI actually decreasing. This has actually been a tremendous cut, affecting the most needy across the entire globe. And like you said, if we can have that commitment that it's 1 year and 1 year only, many, including members from the 2019 intake, will sit down and back off.
Incredibly welcome to hear from the honourable gentleman, and he's right. There has been a double whammy in the reduction. And so international organisations not only have to deal with the cut itself, but also the overall GNI reduction, which is in place because it is there to make sure that in good years there is more money available and in bad years there is less. Therefore, making the argument that we take stock of the economic situation. And it was also made by the member for Tiverton and Honiton, who suggested about the water aid programmes. Of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm not against reform. I believe that we should be able to reform the ODA rules. I would love to see it spent in different ways in which it is more transparent, it is more accountable to people. And many members in this House have made that point. So let us not go forward and take it down to 0.5%, but look at the ways in which we can reform it. From taking it from a single calendar year to a multi-funding 3 or 4 year period would give us the opportunity to look at different options so that we can justify it to our constituents. I believe that global Britain is about 4 things. It is about defence, it is about diplomacy, it is about trade, and it is about development. But all 4 of those things are integrated with one another. Failure to act and to work on one impacts the other. With our 2 aircraft carriers sailing around the world, who are potentially, and I hopefully, unlikely to see conflict, but there is a humanitarian assistance vessel right there that could be used within our ODA budget. We must look at the impact that it has on those different areas. Of course, our aid pays for our security, as I've already mentioned. It is what stops us from seeing all of those terrorist organisations from across the world being able to flourish with unencumbered. And Madam Deputy Speaker, we heard from many across this House saying that if we were leading on these issues, others would follow. And they did. Many other European countries have followed and are now reaching 0.7% targets. Canada has increased its target. America has increased its spending by £16 billion. We were leading, and I ask about the message that it sends to the world. In a year in which we host the G7, in a year in which we host COP26, in a year in which we will have a good presence at CHOGM, we have the opportunity to be able to lead by example. And I hope the government will go back and think, please.
What message does it send? But what message does it say to my constituents that the overseas lives are more valuable than the lives in this country? We've got to be realistic about this. It's not shameful, it's not shameful. But we're talking about messages, and what message does it say? And I asked him, what message does it say?
I would respectfully say to all of his constituents, and I'm happy to speak at any association event in the future, that their lives are no less valuable. But it isn't what we are doing here is taking money from Peter to pay Paul, and it's not going to have it in the correct scenario. We must be honest about the value. Yes, of course I will.
My honourable friend for giving way. I can't obviously speak for the people who have value, but for the people of Bury South, going back and saying actually we're supporting this. To me, that says we're compassionate, it says we're kind, it says we keep our promises. That's something I'm proud of, that's something I want to stick up for, and that's something I want to go home and to be able to tell my daughter that I did the right thing.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and if I had children, I would be going back to say exactly the same thing. All to come, I'm sure. But in the remaining time that I have, Madam Deputy Speaker, this debate is also about the British Council. I have lived in Singapore, I have worked in Nigeria. I have seen... I will in 1 second. I have seen the value that these organisations have. I have seen the value that soft power has in the United Kingdom. And I look back on 2012, a moment in which the UK exhibited its global superpower, soft power, in which we were able to show that we were leading across the world. I hate that we are going down this route and reducing the 2 things that promote us in the best way. And I do give way to the honourable gentleman.
For giving way. Does he agree with me that using us and them attitude is not helpful. The UK is one of the richest countries in the world, and it has a proud record of supporting projects across the world, and dividing people into us and them is not helpful at all in this debate.
The gentleman from Stockport makes a fantastic point, and one that I will end on, which is that if we are uncomfortable with how people view 0.7%, it is down to this House and to us as members to be able to explain it properly and show them the true value of what Britain does in a globalised world. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.